James had always loved the quiet, peaceful suburban life. After years of working hard, saving every penny, and finally getting the right deal, he was able to buy his dream property. The house sat in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and trees that offered shade from the hot sun. James had dreamed of this moment for years, owning a home in a place where the pace of life was slow, and he could finally relax after long work hours. But his excitement soon turned into confusion and frustration when the first letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, arrived. The envelope was plain, with just the HOA's official logo stamped on it. James opened it, expecting something like a welcome letter or a newsletter about the neighborhood. Instead, he was shocked to find that it was a violation notice. The letter accused him of several infractions on his property. According to the HOA, he had neglected his lawn, there were unapproved structural changes to his house, and the fence around his yard wasn't up to their standards. The letter went on to explain that because of these supposed violations, he was required to pay a $250,000 fine. James couldn't believe his eyes. It didn't make sense. He knew he'd taken good care of his property. His lawn wasn't the greenest in the neighborhood, but he didn't think it was a violation. He had also repaired a few parts of the house that were old, like replacing a broken window and patching up some minor cracks in the walls. The fence around his yard was a basic wooden fence, not anything out of the ordinary, but he had made sure it was sturdy and secure. The accusations seemed unfair, especially the steep fine that came with them. Confused and upset, James decided to go straight to the HOA office to figure out what was happening. He assumed there must be some kind of misunderstanding. The HOA was supposed to be there to help residents, not make life difficult for them. But when he arrived at the office, the conversation was less than helpful. The board members were polite but firm, and they quickly dismissed his concerns, insisting that the fine had been issued in accordance with the rules. James tried to explain that the repairs he made to his house were necessary, and that the lawn was just a bit dry because of the weather, not because he didn't care. But no matter how much he explained, the HOA members remained unmoved. One of them, a middle-aged man with glasses and a very serious expression, simply told James, "We have rules, and you have to follow them." It felt like they didn't even care to listen to his side of the story. Before he left, James asked to see the documentation that backed up these claims. He wanted to know exactly what rules he had supposedly broken. The board members told him that they would send him the full report. James left the office with a heavy heart, feeling more confused than ever. Back home, James spent hours going over every detail of the letter. He carefully looked over his property, checking the lawn, the house, and the fence. To his surprise, he found nothing that seemed to justify the fine. The lawn had a few dry patches, but he had already planned to water it and seed it in the fall. The repairs he made to his house were simple and practical. And the fence, well, it had always been a bit old, but it was perfectly functional. Nothing in those details looked like violations to him. Still, the fine was real, and he knew he had to do something about it. The amount was staggering, and the thought of paying such a large fine for something he didn't think was his fault made him feel helpless. James didn't have that kind of money to throw around, and there was no way he could just ignore the situation. It didn't feel right. Frustrated and determined, James decided to investigate further. He wasn't going to let the HOA walk all over him. He spent the next few days researching everything he could about the neighborhood. He talked to neighbors, looked at public records, and even went down to the local city office to find out who owned the land. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but something told him there had to be more to this than just an angry HOA. One evening, while going over the public records, he stumbled upon something that made his heart skip a beat. As he went through the documents, he discovered that he didn't just own his house. He owned more than that, a lot more. The documents showed that the land surrounding his property, the streets, and even the entire neighborhood were all part of a larger piece of land that he had legally purchased years ago, during a land deal he had made with the developer. James couldn't believe it at first. How could he not know this? How had the HOA never told him? As he continued to read the documents, it became clear, he owned the entire neighborhood. The streets, the parks, the empty lots, all of it. The HOA was supposed to be operating on his land, but they had never informed him of this crucial detail. His heart raced as he processed the information. This was big. This was huge. He wasn't just some resident of the neighborhood. He owned the land that the HOA was claiming to control. James quickly made a copy of the documents and sat back, stunned. This was the piece of the puzzle he had been missing. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It didn't take long for him to realize that he was in a position of power, real power. The HOA, which had been so quick to fine him, had no idea who they were dealing with. They had assumed that James was just another homeowner who could be easily intimidated into paying the fine. But now he knew the truth, he was the one in control. Still, James knew he had to be careful. This was a delicate situation, and he couldn't just show up at the HOA office with these documents and expect everything to change overnight. No, he needed to plan his next move carefully. He couldn't let the HOA think they could keep pushing him around. But he also didn't want to escalate things too quickly. He had to make sure he understood all his rights before making any decisions. As James sat there, reflecting on everything, a sense of determination filled him. He wasn't going to let the HOA get away with this. They had made a mistake, and he was going to make sure they paid for it, not just with money, but with the truth. He wasn't going to let them control his life. He wasn't just a homeowner anymore, he was the landowner, and that made all the difference. James felt a rush of excitement. He had no idea where this would go, but one thing was clear, he wasn't going down without a fight. James spent the next few days in a whirlwind of discovery. The more he looked into the documents, the more amazed he became. The neighborhood where he had settled, the one that seemed so familiar with its neat rows of houses and trimmed lawns, was part of something much bigger. It was as if everything around him had been connected in a way he had never realized. And now, with the new information in his hands, he felt empowered yet also overwhelmed. One evening, as James sat in his living room with the paperwork spread out before him, he reflected on everything he had learned. It was clear now that the HOA had no idea who they were messing with. The streets he drove on every day, the park where children played, and the empty lots on the edge of the neighborhood, they all belonged to him. In fact, James was the owner of every single inch of the land that the HOA had been managing. He felt a mix of emotions: anger, excitement, and a little bit of disbelief. How could the HOA have been so bold as to fine him for something as trivial as lawn care when they didn't even know the full extent of his property ownership? They hadn't bothered to tell him that he owned the entire neighborhood, not just the house. James realized that they must have thought he was just another homeowner, someone they could easily push around. But now, the tables had turned, and the truth was in his hands. The next morning, James knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let this go without a fight. He was going to confront the HOA head-on, but he had to be strategic. It wasn't just about proving they were wrong, it was about changing the power dynamic in the neighborhood. The HOA had controlled everything for so long, but now, James had the chance to take that control back. The thought of it made him feel both nervous and determined. He decided to start by gathering more information. He wasn't going to storm into their office unprepared. Instead, he needed to understand exactly how the HOA had been running things, what kind of decisions they had been making, and whether they had been abusing their power. He reached out to other neighbors, hoping they might have some insight into how the HOA had been operating. Over the next week, James had numerous conversations with people who lived in the neighborhood. Most of them were friendly and open about their experiences with the HOA. They all seemed to share a common feeling of discontent. Many of them complained about how strict the HOA was, imposing fines for minor infractions and often ignoring the needs of the residents. Some had even shared stories about how the HOA had tried to impose rules that didn't make sense, like forcing homeowners to replace perfectly good fences or charging excessive fees for things like parking. One of his neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Carter, seemed especially upset with the HOA. She invited James over for coffee one afternoon and shared her own story. "They fined me for not trimming my bushes properly," she said, shaking her head. "But I didn't even know the bushes needed trimming. They never gave me any kind of warning. It was just a bill one day, and it was for hundreds of dollars. I had to pay it, or they said they would take me to court." James listened carefully. It seemed like the HOA had been operating like a dictatorship, issuing fines and making demands without considering the real needs of the people who lived there. The more he listened, the more his resolve grew. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had been taken advantage of by the HOA. The next step was to get legal advice. James knew he needed to understand his rights and the best way to confront the HOA. He found a local lawyer who specialized in property law and set up a meeting. The lawyer, a woman named Claire, listened carefully as James explained everything he had discovered. She was impressed by how thorough he had been in his research. "You're sitting on a gold mine, James," Claire said after a long pause. "The fact that you own the entire neighborhood changes everything. The HOA has been acting like they're the ones in charge, but legally, you have the upper hand. You have the power to make decisions about how this community operates." James felt a sense of relief wash over him. Claire explained that he could take action to have the HOA removed, or at the very least, restructure it so that it operated in a way that was fairer to everyone. She also advised him to be careful about how he proceeded, as there could be some resistance from the HOA board, especially if they didn't want to lose their control. But James was ready. Armed with this knowledge, James knew it was time to take the next step. He wasn't going to let the HOA continue to treat him, or anyone else, unfairly. He sent a formal letter to the HOA, outlining the details of his property ownership and explaining that the fine they had issued was unjust. He also requested a meeting with the board to discuss the matter. He made it clear that he was ready to take legal action if necessary. The letter was direct and professional, but it carried the weight of the truth. As soon as the HOA received the letter, James could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The board didn't respond immediately, but James could tell they were nervous. They must have known that they had made a serious mistake. They had no idea who they were dealing with. James wasn't just a homeowner trying to avoid a fine, he was the owner of the land they were trying to control. Days passed, and James waited for a response. It was an anxious time, but he didn't back down. He knew that patience would be key. Finally, after a week of silence, James received a call from the HOA office. The board had agreed to meet with him. The meeting was set for the following week. James spent the days leading up to it preparing, reviewing his documents, and going over the facts once more. He knew that this was his opportunity to take control of the situation. He wasn't going to let the HOA intimidate him anymore. They had underestimated him, and now it was time to turn the tables. The day of the meeting arrived, and James walked into the HOA office with his head held high. He knew he was in a strong position, but he also knew that he needed to remain calm and collected. The board members were there, seated at a large table, waiting for him to speak. As he walked in, they all looked up, and James could feel their eyes on him. It was clear they were unsure of what to expect. James took a seat and began to speak. He wasn't angry, but his words were firm and measured. He laid out the facts clearly, explaining that he owned the property and that the fine they had issued was unwarranted. He also pointed out that the HOA had been operating without fully understanding the land they were managing. He didn't demand anything, yet he simply wanted them to understand that things were about to change. The board members listened in silence. James could see the shift in their expressions as the reality of the situation set in. They had underestimated him, and now they knew they had no choice but to negotiate. The power was in his hands. James left the meeting that day knowing he had opened a door to a new future for himself and the neighborhood. The fight was far from over, but he had taken the first crucial step toward reclaiming control. And the HOA? They now knew that James wasn't someone they could push around anymore. The days following James' meeting with the HOA board were filled with tension. He had made his point, but he knew the battle was far from over. It wasn't just about proving that he owned the land, it was about changing the way things had been done in the neighborhood for years. The HOA was not going to give up its control easily, and James understood that. But for the first time in a long time, he felt confident. He had the upper hand, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. As he waited for the HOA's response, James took the opportunity to talk more to his neighbors. He had already learned that many of them were unhappy with the way the HOA operated, but now he wanted to hear more. He needed to know if others were willing to support him in his quest to change things. James started organizing small meetings at his house, inviting people to come over and talk about the issues they had with the HOA. One evening, a handful of neighbors gathered at James' house. Among them were Mrs. Carter, who had already shared her experience with the fines, and a few younger families who had been living in the neighborhood for only a couple of years. They all had stories to tell, stories of unfair fines, of strange rules that seemed to serve no real purpose, and of the frustration they felt when the HOA ignored their concerns. Mrs. Carter, now sitting comfortably in one of James' armchairs, leaned forward and spoke with passion. "You know, James," she said, "it's not just about the fines. The HOA has been making our lives miserable for years. They try to control everything. My daughter wanted to paint her front door red, and they told her it had to be white. I mean, what's the harm in a little color?" The others nodded in agreement. James listened carefully, taking mental notes. It wasn't just about the fines. It was about the constant control the HOA exerted over every detail of their lives. And for many of his neighbors, this was more than just a matter of a fine, it was a matter of personal freedom. "We've been putting up with this for too long," another neighbor, Mr. Bennett, chimed in. He was a father of 3 and had been living in the neighborhood for over a decade. "They fined me for my lawn not being perfect, for not having the right kind of mailbox, and even for having a dog that they said was too loud. It's ridiculous." James felt a growing sense of solidarity with these people. They were all victims of the same system, one that prioritized control over the community rather than fostering a sense of fairness or cooperation. They all wanted change, and James now knew that he wasn't alone in this fight. After hearing their stories, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about standing up for his own rights, it was about fighting for everyone's rights. He wasn't going to allow the HOA to continue treating his neighbors like they were powerless. They deserved to have their voices heard, and together, they could make a real difference. Over the next few days, James worked with the group of neighbors to formulate a plan. They knew that they couldn't just go in and demand that the HOA step down immediately. That would make them enemies, and they needed to avoid that. Instead, they decided to start with a petition, a way to show the HOA that the majority of residents wanted change. The goal was to force the HOA to rethink its policies and start listening to the people it was supposed to serve. The petition, which was drafted carefully and thoughtfully, outlined the specific grievances the neighbors had with the HOA. It included complaints about unfair fines, restrictive rules, and the general lack of transparency in the way the HOA made decisions. James made sure that the language was calm and respectful, but firm. They weren't asking for drastic changes, they were simply asking for fairness and the ability to have a say in the way the neighborhood was run. James and his neighbors began going door to door, asking others to sign the petition. They knew this was a delicate task. Some people in the neighborhood were still loyal to the HOA and were skeptical of the changes James was proposing. But surprisingly, many people were receptive. It wasn't long before they had gathered hundreds of signatures, and the momentum began to grow. During this time, James also began gathering more information about the HOA's finances. He had heard rumors about how the HOA had been using the fines to generate income, but he wanted to see for himself if there was any truth to those rumors. After several trips to the city office and many phone calls, James finally managed to get access to the HOA's financial records. What he found shocked him. The HOA had been collecting far more money in fines than it was spending on the neighborhood's upkeep. The funds were not being used for maintenance or improvements, they were being funneled into the pockets of the board members and their associates. James couldn't believe what he was seeing. This wasn't just about overstepping boundaries, it was about abuse of power. James knew that this information could be the key to breaking the HOA's hold on the neighborhood. He shared the financial records with his neighbors, and they were just as appalled as he was. They now had undeniable evidence that the HOA wasn't acting in the best interests of the community. It was using its power to profit at the expense of the residents. Armed with this new information, James felt ready to take his next step. He scheduled another meeting with the HOA board. This time, however, it wasn't going to be a quiet discussion. James was prepared to confront them with the truth, to show them that the residents weren't just going to stand by while they took advantage of them. The day of the meeting arrived, and James felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that this was the moment when everything would change. He arrived at the HOA office with the petition and the financial records in hand, ready to present his case. When the board members saw the petition, they were clearly taken aback. They had expected James to come in with more complaints, but they hadn't expected this kind of organized resistance. The board tried to play it off, saying that they had always acted in the best interests of the neighborhood, but James wasn't having it. He calmly laid out the evidence, showing them how the fines had been used for personal gain, not for the benefit of the community. "This isn't just about lawn care or mailbox design," James said, his voice steady but firm. "This is about how you've been treating the people who live here. You've been using your power to control us, and you've been making money off our backs. We won't stand for it any longer." For the first time, the HOA board was speechless. They had no response. They had been caught, and they knew it. The meeting ended with no immediate resolution, but it was clear that the dynamic had shifted. James and his neighbors had made their point. They had shown the board that they were no longer willing to be treated like children who had no say in their own lives. They had taken a stand, and that stand would not be ignored. James left the meeting feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but he felt confident. The fight wasn't over, but they had made progress. The HOA couldn't keep pushing them around anymore. They had awakened a force in the neighborhood, and it was only a matter of time before that force would be too strong for the HOA to ignore. The meeting with the HOA board had shaken things up more than James had anticipated. It wasn't just that the board had been caught off guard by the petition and the financial records, it was the shift in power. James could feel it in the air. The neighborhood was no longer the quiet, controlled place it had once been. Now, it was a community on the edge of change. People were starting to wake up to the fact that they had more control than they had ever realized. The days after the meeting were tense. James could feel the nervous energy in the neighborhood. His neighbors were excited, but they were also unsure of what would happen next. Would the HOA back down? Would they retaliate? The fear of the unknown lingered, but the sense of solidarity among the residents was stronger than ever. James kept in close contact with his neighbors. They met regularly, either at his house or at the park, to discuss the next steps. Everyone knew that the battle wasn't over. The HOA still held a lot of power, and they weren't going to give it up easily. But James and his neighbors were ready for whatever came next. They had the momentum now, and they weren't going to let it slip away. It was during one of these meetings that Mrs. Carter spoke up. "You know," she said, "the HOA has always been the big boss around here. They've made us feel like we had no choice but to follow their rules. But now, it feels like we finally have a voice. It's our neighborhood, not theirs. Her words struck a chord with everyone in the room. It was true. For years, the HOA had acted as if it were the one in charge, making all the decisions without considering the residents' needs or opinions. But now, thanks to James, the residents were beginning to realize their power. They weren't just homeowners, they were the real owners of the land. The HOA's control had always been an illusion, and now it was starting to crack. With this new sense of empowerment, James and his neighbors decided to escalate their efforts. They knew that the HOA wasn't going to give up without a fight. So, instead of waiting for the HOA to make the next move, they decided to take the initiative. They needed to put more pressure on the board, and they had a plan. The first step was to organize a public meeting. They wanted to give everyone in the neighborhood a chance to express their concerns and opinions about the HOA. It wasn't just about the fines or the rules, it was about the way the HOA had treated everyone for so long. James knew that the more people spoke up, the harder it would be for the HOA to ignore them. It was time to turn the tables. James worked with his neighbors to spread the word. They put up flyers, sent out emails, and talked to as many people as they could. The response was overwhelming. People who had never said a word about the HOA in the past were now excited to take a stand. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the local community center, and James was hopeful that a good number of residents would show up. When the day arrived, the community center was packed. James had never seen so many people in one place, all united by a common cause. As he looked around the room, he saw faces of all ages, from young families to retirees, all there to support the effort to change the way things were run in the neighborhood. It was a turning point, the moment when everything began to shift. James stood at the front of the room and welcomed everyone. He began by talking about his experience with the HOA, explaining how he had felt when the fine was first issued and how he had discovered that he owned not just his property, but the entire neighborhood. He talked about the unfair fines, the strange rules, and the way the HOA had been controlling the lives of the residents for years. As he spoke, James could see the people in the room nodding in agreement. Many of them had similar stories. Some had been fined for trivial reasons, others had been forced to spend money on things that weren't necessary. But everyone agreed on one thing: the HOA had taken too much control, and it was time for that to end. After James finished speaking, Mrs. Carter took the microphone. She shared her own story about how the HOA had fined her for a simple mistake and how they had ignored her pleas for help. She talked about how the board had always treated her like she didn't matter, as if her voice didn't count. The room was quiet as she spoke, and it was clear that her words had struck a nerve. One by one, other residents took the microphone. Each person had their own story to tell, and each one added to the growing sense of injustice that had been festering for years. It was clear that the community was united in their desire for change. The residents were no longer going to sit idly by while the HOA controlled their lives. They had finally found their voice, and they were ready to be heard. By the end of the meeting, James could feel the shift in the air. There was a sense of determination in the room that hadn't been there before. People were standing up and talking about taking action. They were ready to demand that the HOA be held accountable for its actions. James knew that this meeting was just the beginning. It wasn't enough to just talk about the problems, they needed to take real action. The next day, James and his neighbors gathered to discuss their next steps. They knew they couldn't go into a battle with the HOA unprepared. They needed to be strategic, and they needed to make sure that their efforts would have the maximum impact. They decided to form a community council, a group of residents who would represent the neighborhood's interests and act as a voice for everyone. The council would work with the HOA to address the issues and make sure that the residents' concerns were heard. If the HOA refused to cooperate, the council would be ready to take further action, including legal measures if necessary. James was chosen as the first chair of the council, and he felt both honored and nervous. It wasn't a position he had ever expected to be in, but he knew that it was the right time. The neighborhood had changed, and he was now at the center of that change. As the council began to take shape, James and his neighbors worked together to draft proposals for new rules and guidelines for the neighborhood. They focused on fairness, transparency, and community involvement. They wanted to make sure that everyone's voice was heard and that the HOA couldn't just impose rules without consulting the residents. In the weeks that followed, James and the council held several more meetings, and they were able to gather more support from the rest of the neighborhood. The momentum was building, and it felt like nothing could stop them now. But despite all the progress, James knew the real test was still to come. The HOA hadn't responded to the petition or the public meeting, and James suspected that they were trying to wait him out, hoping he would give up. But James wasn't the type to back down. The more the HOA ignored him, the more determined he became. This wasn't just about the neighborhood, this was about standing up for what was right. As the days turned into weeks, James felt the weight of the situation on his shoulders, but he also felt a growing sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but with each passing day, the community grew stronger, and the HOA's grip on the neighborhood seemed to loosen just a little bit more. James knew that change was coming, and he was ready to lead the charge. The days after the formation of the community council passed slowly, but with a sense of anticipation in the air. James could feel the tension growing as he and his neighbors continued to prepare for the showdown with the HOA. They were no longer just standing around waiting for change, they were actively working to create it. The council meetings became more frequent, and the neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. For the first time in years, it felt like the residents had real control over their future. People who had once been quiet, unsure of how to stand up to the HOA, were now speaking out, making suggestions, and sharing their stories. James had always believed in the power of community, but now, as he saw his neighbors coming together in such a powerful way, he felt a deep sense of pride. This was more than just a fight over fines or lawn care, it was a fight for fairness, equality, and the right to be heard. But with all the growing excitement came the constant nagging thought that the HOA was still out there, lurking in the background, unsure of how to respond to the rising tide of community unity. James had spent countless hours in meetings with his neighbors, drafting proposals for new neighborhood guidelines that would put residents' needs first. They wanted a new system where everyone's voice mattered, one that was transparent and fair. In the meantime, the HOA was strangely silent. For weeks, they hadn't issued any new fines or made any statements about the ongoing situation. It was as if they were waiting for something, perhaps hoping that the momentum would fade away or that the residents would lose interest. But that was not going to happen. James could feel the resolve growing stronger with every passing day. The neighbors were ready for whatever came next. The tension finally came to a head when James received an unexpected phone call. It was from the HOA board. They had requested a meeting with him. James wasn't sure what to make of it. After all the silent months, it seemed strange that they would reach out now. But he knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. The HOA wanted to talk, and James was prepared to bring the community's concerns to the table. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and James spent the days leading up to it carefully preparing. He reviewed all the documents, financial records, the petition, the proposed neighborhood guidelines, and made sure he was clear on every point he wanted to address. This was the moment when everything could change, and James wasn't about to let it slip away. On the day of the meeting, James arrived at the HOA office feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. He knew that the HOA was expecting him to be the same person who had walked into that first meeting, unsure of what was going on and overwhelmed by their power. But James had changed. He was no longer just a homeowner trying to fight a fine, he was now a leader, a representative of a community that had come together to take back control. When James entered the room, he saw the familiar faces of the HOA board members. They looked just as they had before, stern, confident, and used to being the ones in charge. But there was a shift in the air. They could sense that James wasn't coming to negotiate like they had expected. He was coming to demand change. The chairperson of the board, a middle-aged man with glasses and a business-like demeanor, spoke first. "James, we understand that there have been concerns in the neighborhood, and we wanted to meet with you to discuss a resolution. James nodded, but he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He had waited too long for this moment. I've spent a lot of time listening to the people in this neighborhood, he said. And I can tell you that they're done with the way the HOA has been running things. The fines, the rules that don't make sense, the lack of transparency, it's all led to a community that feels unheard and ignored. The board members exchanged glances, and James could see that they weren't prepared for this kind of confrontation. But he didn't back down. He had the support of the entire neighborhood, and he wasn't going to let the HOA continue to hold them down. I'm here today to tell you that things need to change, James continued. The residents have spoken, and we've made it clear that we want a voice in the decisions that affect our lives. We want fair rules, transparency, and a system that puts people first, not fines. And if that doesn't happen, we're prepared to take further action. The room was quiet. The board members seemed unsure of how to respond. James knew that they had hoped he would come in with some sort of compromise, but he wasn't interested in compromise anymore. This was about making sure the HOA understood that they were no longer in control. The community was in charge now. After a long silence, the board chairperson spoke. James, we understand your concerns, but the HOA has always acted with the best interests of the neighborhood in mind. We've had rules in place for a reason, and we've always tried to maintain property values and ensure that everyone adheres to a certain standard. James interrupted, not out of anger, but with a calm firmness. I understand that the HOA's role is to maintain certain standards, but the way things have been run isn't about maintaining quality, it's about control. It's about forcing people to follow arbitrary rules that don't serve the community. And it's been going on for too long. He continued, the financial records we've reviewed show that you've been using fines as a source of income. That's not acceptable. The residents are tired of being treated like cash cows. We want fairness, transparency, and a system where our voices matter. At this point, the chairperson seemed a bit rattled. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. But James pressed on. I'm not asking for everything to change overnight, he said. But I'm here to tell you that the community is ready for change. We've made it clear through our petition and public meetings. We have a voice now, and we will continue to use it. If you're not willing to make changes, we'll take action. We'll work with legal experts, and we'll go public if we have to. The days of the HOA dictating everything are over. The room was still. The tension was palpable. The board members exchanged more glances, and James could see that they were weighing their options. Finally, the chairperson spoke again, but this time his tone was different. James, we understand your position, he said, his voice more subdued. We've heard your concerns, and we'll take them into consideration. But we need time to review the situation and find a solution that works for everyone. James could feel the shift. This wasn't the same confident board that had issued fines and ignored complaints. Now, they were on the defensive. They were realizing that they couldn't just sweep things under the rug anymore. The residents weren't backing down, and the community's power was undeniable. I'll give you time, James replied, his voice calm but firm. But make no mistake, change is coming, and we'll be watching closely. The community is united, and we're not going anywhere. The meeting ended soon after, with no immediate resolution, but the seeds of change had been planted. As James walked out of the HOA office, he felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't over yet, but this meeting marked the beginning of the end for the HOA's control over the neighborhood. The community had spoken, and the HOA had no choice but to listen. Now, it was only a matter of time before the neighborhood was transformed into the fair, transparent, and inclusive place it was meant to be.